Okay, this is the second part to our pandemic lesson. Uh, Now we're going to be talking about the Spanish flu. This happened in 1918, right at the start of the United States joining World War One. We started noticing cases in the United States in Fort Scott, Kansas, uh, at some of the boot camps and staging grounds for our troops. Now, since it was a war, the United States was able to censor the media, so reports of the actual flu itself did not get out until after it came back in its second wave, when the troops were returning from World War II. And because Spain was a neutral country, they weren't at war, so their government wasn't censoring the media at the time. Um, More deaths and reports came out of Spain and hit the world news market. So therefore, originally, a lot of people thought it started in Spain, and hence the name. It's hence the reason why it's called the Spanish flu. But in reality, it started in the United States or even possibly Canada. We're not 100% sure. There's a couple of theories going around that again, the disease may have started in China, and as immigrants came to the United States and Canada, they may have brought the disease with them then. But that so far has not been proven. Um, Nor has the fact that it started in Fort Scott, Kansas, but the first reports of deaths due to this disease came from Fort Scott, Kansas, in the United States. So, hence the reason why we believe, for now, that it started in the United States. As you can see here, you can see the trade route patterns. Okay, um, the first wave really it started in the United States, okay, and they've got on this map it's backwards. First, the disease went from the troops in the United States, went across the ocean, went across the Atlantic Ocean, was very prevalent uh, in Europe. A lot of the disease that they talk about during the um, trench warfare during the uh, World War One was caused by the Spanish flu, by the influenza N1H1. Yes, that same disease that we get a shot for every year here today. But the disease really it devastated the troops on both sides of the war. Matter of fact, they believe that uh, the reason why the Germans surrendered during World War II was because they got hit so hard by the flu epidemic and or pandemic, and they weren't 100% sure that the disease wasn't the cause for their surrender. So this is an infographic of the um, Spanish flu. I had to cut this up a little bit so it would fit on our screens, but you'll get the general idea. So the 1918 Spanish flu was a new strain of the world had never seen before. So humans did not have any natural immunities. Just like COVID, we have zero immunities to this. We are only uh, just now having people who have survived the disease, so their antibodies are being built up. We as a society have to develop what's called a herd immunity, which means that the majority of the population will have needed to come in contact with the disease and develop significant amount of uh, antibodies to fight the disease on a regular basis if it becomes seasonal. Um, Now, if and that's the reason why COVID is so devastated right now is because we don't have a herd mentality and so or herd immunity. So if we get a whole bunch of people sick with it, we're going to have a lot of people who are going to be hospitalized. Unlike now when we get N1H1, yeah, sure, we may be really sick at home, but for the most part, we've come in contact with the disease several times, and which means we have some immunity built up in our own natural systems to fight this. On COVID, we do not. And that's the reason why it's hitting us so hard. Um, the flu is one of the deadliest pandemics on record, ultimately claiming 50 million people million lives worldwide. Those are the reported cases. Now you can almost double that number for unreported cases. Um, One third of the world's population may have been infected. Right now, we're only seeing about uh, 20 to 25% of the United States or of the world being infected by COVID, at least as the projection. Now, we haven't reached that number yet, but we're only thinking that 20-25% of the population may be affected. Many of you may be thinking, well, that's not a big deal then. But if the disease were to mutate, that number could change. So about 33% of the world's population back then came in contact with it. The flu swept the globe in 3 waves. We are only on the first wave of COVID. So that is the reason why we're still up in the air as to what our future is going to look like. That's the reason why they're saying that we may be wearing masks and gloves for a really long time because of the different waves of the disease. Asia, it first reported in Asia. Again, there's that theory, but you still have the theory that the first reports came from either Canada or the United States. It spread within a year's time to encircle the flu and encircle the world, and it became a seasonal flu. That means it comes in the fall and in the spring when the temperatures are very moist and cool, which makes a good breeding ground for viruses. Um, Late 1800s through March 1900s saw the third, uh, less fatal wave of the pandemic as it spread throughout the United States and Europe. 1918 March was one of the deadliest years. August was one of the second waves, and as the troops were embarking they into new territories such as Africa and Europe, they brought the disease with them. It killed more than 10,000 people per week in some American cities, like Philadelphia. Philadelphia was devastated by the flu. Philadelphia would be the hot spot, like New York City is today. It is called the mother of all pandemics. The symptoms included normal signs of flu infection, such as fever, body aches, as well as nausea and diarrhea. Patients might later develop severe pneumonia, which means fluid in the lungs, and their skin would turn blue. It was called the Blue Death. I know we had the Black Death before. This one was called the Blue Death. And if you watch a lot of videos about the 1918 pandemic, you'll hear them refer to it as the Blue Death. Um, and the reason why they turned blue is because of the lack of oxygen that they were getting due to their lungs being filled with this fluid. It was difficult for doctors to treat flu victims. No flu vaccines existed, such as like we have COVID today. Many patients were isolated in large wards set up in houses and infected. Some people turned to common drugstore treatments such as Vic VapoRub with little to no effect. We also have to remember during this time period, they did not know what a virus was. They knew what bacteria was, but they didn't know what a virus was. So they didn't know how to fight this one. Simple antibiotics did not kill the flu vaccine or did not kill N1H1. Streets were eerily quiet because they first implemented social distancing during this time period. Um, Schools closed, garbage went uncollected, so you can imagine how unbearable that would have been smelling in the streets. Telephone services collapsed because people didn't want to go out into the public and go use telephones. Back then, they had to manually plug lines together. They didn't have computers that do that on a switchboard. You actually had a person who would stand there and connect one line to another line manually. Um, but it even became a crime to shake hands because they knew that it was like they knew about bacteria and that how bacteria could be spread, but they weren't quite for sure how this one is. So you had about 50 million people die worldwide, and in the United States, we had about 675,000 people die. Um, you had an infection rate of 1 in 4 people. So that's an R naught scale of 9 or 10. Measles had an R0 scale of 12 and 13. So that means if you go into a room of 10 people, you're going to affect anywhere between 7 to 9 people of a 10-person room. Measles would infect everybody in that room, and then the people standing outside the hallway, as the joke would go. So, but for the most part, it was pretty bad disease. It spread very easily. You can see here the mortality rates. The New York is the solid line, London is the dash, Paris is the dot, and Berlin is the dash dot dot dash line. And so you can see how even New York itself was hit pretty hard. Expressed uh, a rate of about 1,000 deaths per week during October, November. Now, what I want you to also notice is that there are 3 bumps here. You have a little one in June, July, then you have a big one in November, and then you have one in February and March. Okay, the reason why these dots or these lines end here is because they stopped reporting the cases. But if you look at London, they continued to report cases. Um, so they saw a kind of a seasonal wave of diseases. Now, I wonder if COVID is going to have that same effect. And you can see here on this one, okay, compare the different cities. I want you to pause this real quick, and I want you to look to see if you can determine which cities implemented social distancing and whether or not it was effective. Did they do social distancing good enough? Now pause the video. Okay, welcome back. Those cities that implemented social distancing, you can see that it died off very quick. Even though Philadelphia here has a high spike, its secondary spike isn't that big. New Orleans had a high spike and then it didn't here. Now look at Omaha, okay? It did social distancing, but it didn't do it for very long. And then it had a huge secondary spike again, okay? I wonder if this second spike right here would have been a lot less if they had continued social distancing. You could look here at Denver. They did social distancing twice, okay? And their deaths were pretty low. Now look at Baltimore, New Orleans. They only did it for a couple of weeks, yet they're pretty high. Poor Washington, D.C. right here got hit pretty hard. Okay, I'm going to stop the video right here and then we're going to talk about the coronavirus.